Jason's text flashes across my screen. Running late. Can you take the bus? Still, I don't answer, my fingers lingering over the phone as I call a cab instead. As I settle into the back seat, the familiar city sounds fade into a heavy silence. The same silence I felt for years as his mother. That's when it hits. I've been nothing but an afterthought to him, invisible, always waiting, but not anymore. The inheritance he's been counting on. He'll never see a penny, and he'll never know why. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Ruth stepped out of the cardiology office, her legs feeling like they were made of stone. The appointment had gone fine, nothing new, just the usual fatigue, a little dizziness, and the routine follow-up. But today, the weight of it all felt different. She could feel the years catching up to her, creeping in, slowing her down, making everything seem a little harder. She fumbled for her phone in her purse and dialed Jason's number. He had promised to pick her up today, just like he always did, or used to. The phone rang, then went to voicemail. Jason, Ruth murmured softly to herself. She tried again, same result. The echo of her call seemed to linger in the empty air, reminding her of just how often this had been happening lately. She stood there for a moment, eyes scanning the parking lot, watching cars pass by, all filled with people going somewhere, doing something. A car pulled away from the curb, a sleek black sedan, and Ruth felt a pang of loneliness. She didn't want to wait. She didn't want to call a cab or take the bus. But she was used to it now, wasn't she? She waited, letting the moment pass. Then, her phone buzzed with a message from Jason. Running late. Drinks with the team. Can you Uber? Ruth stared at the screen, her fingers curling slightly around the edges of the phone. She didn't respond. There was no Uber account on her phone. There was no plan for that, no safety net. Jason knew this. It had always been him. Always. Her heart sank, but she didn't let herself feel angry. Not yet. She turned and walked toward the bus stop, her shoes tapping softly on the pavement, the world around her moving too fast. The city had always felt like it was bustling with energy, but now, as she stood waiting for the bus, it felt cold. The kind of cold that came when you realized you weren't part of the rush anymore. Just an afterthought in a sea of moving bodies. When the bus finally came, it screeched to a stop, and Ruth stepped on, fumbling for the fare. The driver barely looked up as she handed him the crumpled bills. She took the last available spot, standing, gripping the pole as the bus lurched forward. It was crowded, too crowded. She didn't even mind, though. Her thoughts were louder than the buzz of the conversations around her. The bus bounced along the streets, passing through neighborhoods she knew well, but they looked different today. The faces in the windows didn't seem to notice her, or if they did, it was only a passing glance. Ruth felt the ache of being invisible, of being just one more face in the crowd. She wasn't even sure why she felt so alone. It wasn't like she'd expected Jason to drop everything for her, but she had, foolishly, thought today might be different. At her stop, she stepped off the bus and walked the few blocks home, her mind still circling. By the time she reached her front door, it was quiet, like it always was when Jason was gone. He was probably still at that rooftop bar, laughing with his coworkers, posting photos of his drinks. When Ruth opened her phone again, his photo was there, front and center, cocktail in hand, smiling broadly. Work hard, play harder. She stared at the picture for a long moment, the edges of her vision blurring. Was this what he thought of her now? Just another inconvenience. Another task to put off until it was convenient. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She didn't know what she was waiting for. An apology? A sign? But there was nothing. Instead, she set the phone down a little too hard on the table and let out a sigh. Ruth wasn't sure how long she stood there, but eventually she forced herself to move, pulling open the cabinet to grab a mug. She didn't want to think about what she had just seen, about the way she felt, like something left on the curb, forgotten. But the images from the bar lingered, taunting her. Ruth sank into a chair, staring out the window at the fading light. It wasn't about the ride. It wasn't about the bus. It was about something deeper, something she couldn't ignore anymore. This was what it felt like to be invisible, to be forgotten. But something inside her shifted. Just a little. Maybe she didn't need to keep waiting for someone to remember her. Maybe she could do the remembering herself. Her fingers tightened around the mug. She wasn't going to be left behind again. Not this time. The morning light filtered weakly through the blinds, casting long shadows across the living room. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. The bitterness a perfect match for the heaviness in her chest. The room was quiet. Jason hadn't come home yet. Not that she expected him to. She hadn't heard from him either, just the usual silence that had become the norm in recent years. The image of his face in that photo, cocktail raised in the air as if he were celebrating something important, kept playing in her mind. She had stood in the kitchen long after he had sent that message, her eyes lingering on the screen, the edges of her vision starting to blur. That was the moment when she realized how far they had drifted, how little he cared. It wasn't about the ride, it wasn't about the bus, it was about the fact that he hadn't even noticed. Not really. And that had been the breaking point. By the time the sun had crept up fully, Ruth knew what she had to do. She didn't feel any lighter, but the decision had taken root. She reached for her phone and dialed the number she had not called in years, Claire Ellis, her lawyer, her protector, the one person in her life who still treated her like she mattered. "Good morning, Ruth. What can I do for you today?" Claire's voice was calm, but Ruth could feel the undercurrent of alertness. Claire always knew when something was coming. "I need to come in," Ruth said, her voice steady but tight. "It's time to rewrite everything." Claire didn't ask any questions. She simply agreed, and Ruth hung up the phone. She wasn't ready to call anyone else, at least not yet. But Emma's name flickered in her mind as she grabbed her coat. Emma was the only one who still cared, the only one who would understand. She called for a cab, the same one she had used 100 times before, and within minutes it pulled up to the curb outside her house. Ruth settled into the back seat, the leather cool against her skin. She stared out the window as the city rolled by, the streets so familiar, yet somehow distant. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something behind, something precious. But the truth was, there wasn't much left to hold on to. Not with Jason. The cab sped down familiar streets, past the coffee shop where she had met Jason's father decades ago, past the park where they used to take Emma when she was little. The city seemed to pulse with a rhythm she no longer recognized. She wasn't part of that world anymore, the world where family mattered, where promises held weight. No, she had stepped outside of it. And now, the only thing that mattered was what was in her hands, her future, her legacy. The cab turned onto the quiet street where Claire's office was, a nondescript building tucked away in a corner of the city that felt like a different time. Ruth paid the driver and stepped out, her feet moving quickly as she walked through the glass doors. The quiet, sterile lobby greeted her with the familiar scent of leather and paper, the cool air of professionalism. Claire's office was just down the hall, where she had spent many hours discussing wills and trusts. But today felt different. Today felt final. "Ruth, come in," Claire said, her eyes immediately scanning Ruth's face. "You look like you've made a decision." "I have," Ruth replied, her voice low but firm. "It's time to change things." They sat down, the legal pad between them, and Ruth handed Claire a copy of her will. Jason was listed as the sole beneficiary. Everything would go to him, everything she had worked for, every decision she had ever made, until now. "I wrote this when he was still picking me up," Ruth said quietly, the words hanging in the air between them. Claire nodded, taking the document and scanning it briefly. "You've changed, Ruth, and so must this." She paused, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. "We can revoke this will entirely, add some conditional clauses, or remove him completely." Ruth didn't hesitate. "I want him to get exactly what he gave me, nothing." Claire's eyes softened, a flicker of understanding passing over her face. "Understood. We'll make it so." She began to make notes, her pen moving swiftly across the paper. "I'll prepare a new trust for you. It will be irrevocable, and once we file it, there will be no turning back. You're sure about this?" Ruth nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." As Claire spoke about the options, the logistics, Ruth's mind wandered, briefly, to Emma. She hadn't heard from her this morning, but that was normal. Emma had her own life now, her own struggles. But at least Emma still remembered. She was still the one who cared. The one who asked. Just then, Ruth's phone buzzed, snapping her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Emma. Hey, Grandma, just checking in. How are you doing? Ruth's heart warmed, the coldness of the previous days melting just a little. She smiled to herself as she typed back. You're the only one who remembers to ask. Claire looked up from her notes, catching Ruth's smile. It's good to have someone who sees you, Ruth. I know, Ruth replied, her voice steady now. And I'm not going to forget her. Not ever. As Claire finalized the details, Ruth's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a call from Jason. Ruth's fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't answer. She didn't need to anymore. Not this time. The city lights flickered as Ruth's cab hummed through the streets. The faint warmth of the car seat pressing against her back. The trust had been set. Jason and Leah were out. Emma was in, and Ruth felt a strange sense of peace settle into her bones. She could still feel the weight of the papers, the irrevocable trust, sealed and filed. And it was a heavy weight, but it was her weight, her decision. As the cab pulled up to her house, she wasn't sure what to expect. There was no sign of Jason, not that she was waiting for him, but the emptiness of the house felt more profound than usual. She had lived with it for years, quiet evenings in a house that echoed too loudly, but now it felt different, final. She entered the house and placed the envelope with the trust on the kitchen table. She had to hold it, just for a moment, letting it sink in. This was it. There was no going back. The silence of the house felt almost sacred now. A knock on the door broke her reverie. Ruth's heart skipped. It wasn't Jason. She knew that. She opened the door to find Wendy standing there, her coat wrapped tightly around her. Thought I'd bring some coffee, Wendy said, holding out a thermos and a mug. You know, in case you need it. Ruth smiled faintly and stepped aside. Come in. They moved to the kitchen, the warm scent of coffee filling the room as Wendy set everything on the table. Ruth took a long sip, feeling the heat spread through her. The silence between them was comfortable. Ruth didn't need to explain herself yet. She wasn't sure where to start. You've been quiet lately, Wendy said after a moment, her eyes studying Ruth, as if waiting for her to say something. Ruth placed her cup down gently, staring into the dark liquid. She hadn't planned to talk about it, but now, in the quiet of her kitchen, it felt right. I'm cleaning house, she said softly, legally. Wendy raised an eyebrow, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. What do you mean by that? Ruth leaned back in her chair, her fingers curling around the edge of her cup. I've made changes to the will. The trust, too. Jason and Leah, they're out. I can't keep pretending. Wendy nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. About time, she said. I was waiting for you to do something like this. Ruth took another sip of her coffee, letting the warmth settle into her chest. She hadn't expected Wendy's approval, but hearing it helped. It had taken years of holding back, years of waiting for Jason to wake up, to see her, to understand. But she had realized, finally, that she was done waiting. The sound of Ruth's phone buzzing pulled her back into the moment. She glanced at the screen. Jason. You good? She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen. But there was nothing to say. There was no point in answering. She wasn't his fallback anymore. She wasn't going to keep giving when he couldn't even show up. She put the phone face down on the table and looked up at Wendy. It's done. I'm not looking back. Wendy's eyes softened, but she didn't press Ruth for more details. You don't have to. You've done what you needed to do. Ruth felt something shift within her. She wasn't waiting for Jason's response or for Leah's empty promises. She wasn't waiting for their acknowledgement anymore. The trust was in place, and Emma, her granddaughter, was the only one who had earned it. She smiled to herself, feeling a quiet sense of pride. The door buzzed with a reminder of the world outside. Jason's text still sat there, unread. But Ruth didn't need to open it. She didn't need anything from him anymore. As Wendy finished her coffee, Ruth felt the weight of the papers resting in the kitchen, secure and final. There was nothing left to prove. No more waiting to do. The next chapter of Ruth's life had begun, and she was ready. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, her phone buzzing in front of her. She stared at Jason's message for a long moment, her fingers hovering over the screen. Unfortunately, my financial plans have changed. The words felt final, as if they sealed the door that had been quietly creaking shut for years. She pressed send, setting the phone down without another thought. There was no need to say more. She had made her decision. Jason and Leah had been indifferent, distant, and now it was time to let them go. Moments later, the response pinged on her screen. "Okay, thanks for the clarity." Ruth's chest tightened, but she couldn't tell if it was from anger or relief. His cold reply confirmed everything she had suspected. Jason wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt. He was just unaffected. She wasn't surprised, but the weight of his indifference still stung. The house was too quiet, like it had been for years. Ruth picked up her glass of wine and took a slow sip, her thoughts wandering back to Claire's office. There was one more thing to do, one more piece of the puzzle. The next day, she returned to Claire's office, the weight of the trust in her bag, the final version in her hands. It was time to put the last touch on everything. Claire was already waiting when Ruth walked in, her face unreadable but patient. Ruth sat down, the envelope resting between them. She had to do this. "I need to write something," Ruth said quietly, her voice steady. "A letter to Jason and Leah." Claire didn't ask for specifics. She just nodded. "A personal letter?" Ruth's voice was soft but firm. "Yes. Something to explain why I've made this choice. Something they can read when I'm gone." Claire made a few notes, understanding the gravity of what Ruth was asking. "I'll file it with everything else. It's not legally binding, but I'll keep it safe." Ruth didn't need it to be legal. It was for her peace, not theirs. After a few moments, she started to write, "You weren't too busy. You were too indifferent." That was all. That was enough. She didn't need to explain more. They hadn't earned her time or her energy. The truth was simple. Later that afternoon, Emma came over, as she often did on weekends. Ruth couldn't wait to see her, to feel the comfort of someone who still cared, someone who hadn't forgotten. They spent the next couple of hours going through old family photos, sorting them into albums, reminiscing about people and places that now seemed distant. "Grandma, look at this one," Emma said, holding up a faded photo of Ruth and her late husband, smiling in front of their old house. "You two were so happy here." Ruth smiled softly, feeling a pang of nostalgia. "We were," she said quietly. She had lived so much of her life putting others first, especially Jason, hoping he would see her, but it was Emma who truly saw her. As they worked, Ruth pulled out a small card. Handwritten with love and care, she slid it across the table to Emma. "For you," Ruth said, her voice thick. "I just want you to know, you never treated me like an errand." Emma blinked, her eyes watering slightly as she opened the card. She read the words, and her face softened. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I love you." Ruth didn't need to say anything more. The silence between them was filled with understanding. Emma was the one who saw her, and that was all that mattered. Later that evening, Ruth sat back in her chair, the letter still in front of her, unopened by anyone but herself. It wasn't for Jason or Leah. It was for her, her final words, her final act of release. The weight of the past had lifted. She had made her decision, and now the future was her own. The quiet of the house felt peaceful now, not lonely. Ruth closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the evening settle in. It was done. Finally, it was done. Ruth's phone buzzed once, then again, a third time. The name on the screen was unmistakable. Jason. She stared at it for a moment, fingers hovering over the screen. She knew exactly what the message would be. He'd want to talk about money, about the inheritance. But there was no need for that. Not anymore. She let the phone ring, the soft vibration a reminder of how long she had waited for him to care, to show up. It had never come. And now, it didn't matter. Moments later, the voicemail notification popped up. Ruth hesitated, then pressed play. "Hey, just checking in. Need to talk money stuff. Call me when you get a chance." Ruth set the phone down on the table, the sound of his voice lingering in the quiet room. She didn't even want to listen to the rest. She had heard it all before. Empty words meant to pull her back into a game she was done playing. With a steady hand, she hit delete. The sound of the voicemail vanishing felt like the last step in cutting ties. There was nothing more to say. She didn't need him anymore, not for money. Not for validation, not for anything. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter with every second. Ruth looked out the window, watching the city go on, unaware of her quiet transformation. The world hadn't stopped, but it felt like her life had. Like she had finally stepped off the treadmill she'd been running on for far too long. Later, Ruth made her way to Claire's office. The trust was filed now, everything official. Ruth's future was secured, and there was nothing Jason or Leah could do to change that. The legal weight had been lifted. "Everything's done," Claire said, handing Ruth the final documents. "It's official now. Your plans are in place." Ruth took them, feeling the weight of the papers in her hands. But it was a different weight now, one of certainty. She had taken control, and the future was hers, untethered from the past. Her financial planner had already updated her portfolio. Simplified. Unreachable by Jason, by anyone. Ruth had done it all carefully, methodically. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was hers. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was Wendy. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Wendy asked, her voice warm and knowing. "This is the part where you breathe again." Ruth smiled. A real smile. "Better than I expected," she replied. The weight had shifted. For the first time in years, Ruth wasn't waiting for anyone to change. She wasn't waiting for a call or an apology. She had freed herself. The next morning, Ruth scrolled through social media while sipping her coffee. She paused when she saw Leah's post, "Manifesting wealth, not waiting for it." Ruth stared at the words, a laugh escaping her lips. It was everything she needed to know. Leah was still playing the same game, but Ruth was done. She wasn't waiting for anything or anyone. With a quiet sigh, Ruth set the phone down and looked out the window. The sun was just beginning to rise, and for the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. The future was hers, and it was time to live it, on her terms. Ruth heard the knock at the door before she saw Jason. He hadn't been invited. He never was, but the doorbell rang, and there he was, standing on the other side with his best smile plastered across his face, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "Hey, Mom," he said, holding a coffee cup in one hand. "Thought we should catch up." Ruth didn't move right away. She was still sitting at the kitchen table, her cup half full, untouched. She didn't need to stand up, didn't need to play the role she'd always played for him. The role that was now, somehow, gone. She gave him a long look before getting up slowly and walking over to the couch, sitting down across the room from him. It was deliberate, a quiet reminder of where they now stood. The space between them wasn't just physical. It was something more. Jason walked in, stepping around the small pile of mail on the table and settling onto the armchair across from her. The coffee in his hand was still warm, the steam rising from the cup as he took a long sip, watching her all the while. "So," he began, his voice too casual, as if nothing had changed, as if the air hadn't shifted irreparably. "I've been meaning to ask, are you still planning to help us with the lake house?" The question landed like a stone, heavy and deliberate. Ruth's fingers tightened around her mug, her gaze never leaving him. "No," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "And I'm not planning to explain it either." Jason blinked, caught off guard for just a moment. His fingers, still wrapped around the coffee cup, seemed to lose their grip, his posture momentarily stiffening. The charm he had been working so hard to maintain fell away like a mask slipping off. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly. The usual pretense of easy confidence replaced with something closer to confusion. Ruth set the cup down on the table in front of her, the soft sound of porcelain meeting wood punctuating the space between them. She let the silence linger for a moment, letting him wait before she finally spoke. "I changed direction," she said, keeping her voice even. "That's all." Jason didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes flickered to the side, then back at her, like he was trying to find some hint of hesitation, some crack in the wall she'd built. But there was nothing. Ruth didn't budge. There was no room for negotiation anymore, no room for the old patterns. Jason's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Ruth almost felt pity for him. But it didn't last. He had made his choices. She had made hers. For a moment, he just sat there, his face searching for an explanation that Ruth wasn't willing to give. She didn't owe him one, not anymore. She had given him all the chances he would ever get. "I don't get it," Jason said, his voice softer now, a touch of vulnerability creeping through. "We've always been a team. Why change now?" Ruth met his eyes steadily, the weight of years of disappointment pressing down on her chest. She hadn't been part of his team in a long time. Maybe she never had been. "Because I've been the one showing up all these years, Jason," Ruth said, her voice sharp now. "And you've been too busy to notice." Jason's eyes flickered with something that could have been guilt, but Ruth didn't care anymore. She wasn't waiting for his apology. Not today. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged. Jason opened his mouth to speak again, but Ruth stood up before he could find the words. "Goodbye, Jason," she said, turning away, not looking back. She didn't need to hear what he would say next. As she walked out of the room, the door softly clicking behind her, Ruth felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. She had said what she needed to say. It was done. The house had always been full of things Jason had left behind. Old photos, half-finished projects, mementos of moments that no longer mattered. But now, as Ruth stood in the living room, looking at the faded wallpaper that had once been her attempt to make their home welcoming for him, she knew it had to go. She began pulling at the edges of the paper, the glue loosening with the rip of each strip. It wasn't out of spite, not anymore. She wasn't tearing things down to hurt him. She was building something for herself, for her own peace. She had given him years of chances, of forgiveness, but now she was cleaning the slate. Ruth moved methodically through the room, unpinning old pictures from the walls, ones she had hung with the intention of making him feel like part of the home. Family photos, vacation snapshots, all the things Jason had once promised to cherish, now reduced to nothing but paper and memory. She pulled them from the frames, bundled them up, and placed them carefully in a box. There was no bitterness, just a quiet relief. She didn't need these relics to validate her anymore. And if Jason had truly cared, he wouldn't have left these things behind in the first place. The doorbell rang, breaking the stillness of the house. Ruth glanced over at the clock. It was Emma, as she had promised. Ruth smiled softly as she opened the door. Her granddaughter stood there, grinning, a bag slung over her shoulder and her eyes bright. "Grandma," Emma exclaimed, wrapping her arms around Ruth in a tight hug. "It's good to see you, sweet girl," Ruth said, holding her close. Emma stepped back, taking in the living room, the stripped wallpaper, the bare walls. "Redoing the place, huh?" Emma asked, her voice light but curious. Ruth nodded. "It's time." Together, they set to work. Ruth handed Emma a paint roller, and they began the task of repainting the hallway, a space Ruth had always kept neutral, always waiting for Jason's approval. Now, there was no more waiting. The walls would be a color of her choosing, reflecting the new boundaries she had drawn, not just for the house, but for her life. As the day stretched on, the smell of fresh paint mingled with the scent of cornbread baking in the oven. They worked in easy silence, the kind of quiet that felt comfortable between them. Emma's presence, the sound of her laughter, made the house feel more alive than it had in years. They were creating something together, something that was just for them. Later, as they sat at the kitchen table, still warm slices of cornbread between them, Emma looked at Ruth with a thoughtful expression. "I think your parents would have been proud of you," she said quietly. Ruth smiled softly, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Your parents want comfort," she said, her voice steady. "I needed respect." Emma nodded, understanding more than Ruth had expected. The weight of that sentence hung between them, but it wasn't a burden, it was just truth. Ruth had needed respect, respect for her time, her love, her boundaries. She had given it freely for so long, and now it was time to protect what was hers. As they finished their meal, Ruth looked out the window. The world was changing outside, just as it had inside her home. Ruth felt lighter, more sure of herself than she ever had before. The walls had been stripped of what had once been, and now she was free to build what she wanted, to fill the space with what mattered most. She reached for Emma's hand across the table, squeezing it gently. Thank you for being here, Ruth said. For being the one who remembers. You're the only one who's ever really seen me. Emma squeezed her hand back, her eyes soft. I'll always see you, Grandma. The light from the setting sun spilled into the room, casting a warm glow over them both. For the first time in a long time, Ruth felt completely at home, free from the past, at peace with the future. The walls were different now, but it was more than just the paint. It was everything that had changed inside her. She wasn't just redecorating a house, she was reclaiming her life. And no one would take that from her. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between a bill and a catalog she'd never order from. Ruth glanced at it idly until the weight of it sank in. Jason and Leah's anniversary celebration. For a moment, she considered throwing it away without opening it, but something stopped her. She ripped open the envelope. No RSVP, no mention of her name. Not a single line that suggested her presence mattered. Just an elegant request for attendance at an event that clearly wasn't meant for her. The words blurred as Ruth stared at the invitation, her chest tightening. No seat for her. Just the cold expectation that she would show up, like she always had, quietly contributing to their lives without any recognition in return. Ruth let the invitation drop onto the table, her eyes lingering on the words she could not ignore. Join us for an evening of celebration. The irony stung more than it should have. Wendy's voice echoed in her mind. They assume you'll pay for the wine you won't drink. Ruth had always been the one left to cover the costs of things that never truly involved her. The wine, the dinners, the gifts. She had paid, but she had never been part of the celebration. She sat there for a long moment, silent. Then, without a word, Ruth took the invitation and placed it in the trash. It wasn't about being petty. It was about recognizing the truth. And the truth was that Jason and Leah hadn't invited her into their world in years. The phone rang, breaking the quiet. It was Claire. Ruth, what's on your mind? Claire's voice was warm, though Ruth knew she'd probably already guessed. I need a letter, Claire, to Jason and Leah. Something to be opened only after I'm gone. There was no hesitation on the other end. Claire was used to Ruth's decisions now. The way Ruth always seemed to know exactly what she needed. What do you want it to say? Claire asked softly. Ruth thought for a moment. Then the words came out, simple but final. Inheritance was never a reward for blood. It was for presence. Claire paused, likely absorbing the weight of Ruth's words. I'll draft it right away. Ruth hung up, then leaned back in her chair, a sense of calm washing over her. She had done all she could for them. The rest was out of her hands. A few days later, Ruth sat at her desk and drafted her obituary. She had never imagined she would write it herself, but there it was. Her name, her story, a history that had been defined by the choices she had made. But now, the last part of that story was her own. She wrote carefully, deliberately, I leave no legacy to those who took my time for granted. The names of Jason and Leah will not appear here. They are not part of the story I wish to tell. It felt right. This was the final act of freedom, a statement of her own legacy, written on her terms. She sealed the envelope with a quiet sense of closure. The doorbell rang just as she was finishing. It was Emma, of course. Her granddaughter had been her constant. And Ruth's heart warmed just seeing her. Grandma, Emma grinned, stepping inside with a bag of textbooks and her ever-present optimism. Come in, sweetheart, Ruth said, embracing her tightly. How's the project going? Emma's eyes lit up and she handed Ruth a folder. I added your name to my college research project on financial elder justice. I thought it was only right. Ruth opened the folder, her eyes brimming with pride as she read Emma's notes. The project was about people who reclaim control over their financial futures. People like Ruth. Thank you, Emma, Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. I never imagined anyone would see me this way. Emma smiled. I'll always see you, Grandma. Ruth reached across the table, squeezing Emma's hand. The walls of the house had been torn down, replaced by something real, something she could build with the people who truly mattered. The future wasn't about Jason or Leah anymore. It was about Emma, and the peace Ruth had finally claimed for herself. And as the sun set, Ruth knew it would be enough. More than enough. Ruth sat in the polished conference room, the muted hum of fluorescent lights above her creating an almost meditative silence. Across from her, the financial advisor shuffled through papers, still trying to process the shift in Ruth's plans. Jason's name had once been at the top of the list, but now that had changed. The advisor, a middle-aged man in a pressed suit, cleared his throat. I understand that Jason was expecting to inherit a substantial amount from you, Ruth. His expectations were clear. I think it's important we address that moving forward. Ruth didn't flinch. She hadn't expected any less. The world Jason inhabited, where expectations were based on entitlement, was foreign to her now. She had given him more than enough chances, and she was done. He's no longer a beneficiary, Ruth said calmly, her voice steady as she adjusted the documents in front of her. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. The decision had been made, and she wasn't about to undo it. The advisor looked up sharply, eyes widening, but Ruth only met his gaze with quiet certainty. She wasn't there to explain herself. She had already made her peace. I'll have Claire draft a follow-up, the advisor muttered, trying to reframe the conversation. But Ruth, you must understand. This will cause a significant disruption. Ruth nodded slowly, her gaze soft but unyielding. It's already been disrupted, she said, more to herself than to him. And I'm at peace with it. A few days later, Ruth sat at her kitchen table, the stillness of the house now a companion she had grown accustomed to. The phone rang again, Jason's name flashing on the screen. She sighed, feeling a momentary flicker of something between frustration and relief. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, it was simply another call she didn't need to take. Ruth picked up the phone. "Mom, we need to talk," Jason's voice came through, panicked, louder than usual. "What's going on with the will? You can't just—" Ruth cut him off, her tone firm, yet calm. "I've sent you Claire's business card, Jason. She'll handle it." Without waiting for a response, she hung up and immediately dialed Claire. "Please send him a cease communication letter," Ruth instructed. "He's had his chance." Minutes later, Claire confirmed the action was in motion. Jason would get the message loud and clear. He had no claim to anything that Ruth had once given him. Ruth set the phone down, feeling the familiar weight of relief settle on her chest. She wasn't angry anymore, she was simply done. Later that afternoon, Ruth sat with Emma at the kitchen table. They were going over Emma's college applications, the sound of her granddaughter's laugh filling the quiet spaces of the room. Ruth felt the warmth of the moment, a contrast to the cold reality of Jason's call. Emma hesitated for a moment, glancing at her phone. "Grandma, I updated my FAFSA. The funds are all set now, thanks to you," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. Ruth smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze Emma's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, but it meant more than words could express. Emma had always been the one to honor her, to see her for who she truly was. That was worth more than anything Jason could have claimed. That evening, Ruth's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. She didn't hesitate. She blocked it. Wendy's words came back to her, quiet but powerful. "Your silence is the best volume you've ever used." Ruth smiled softly to herself. There was a power in that silence, a strength she hadn't fully understood until now. She had spent years trying to fit herself into a world that didn't see her, but no longer. She had reclaimed her peace, her boundaries, and she was free. As she looked out the window, the sun dipping below the horizon, Ruth felt a quiet certainty wash over her. The future was hers now, not defined by Jason or Leah or anyone who thought they could take from her. She wasn't waiting anymore, she was living. Ruth sat at her kitchen table, scanning the final draft of the trust on her phone. The weight of the paperwork was lighter now that everything had been set in stone. Jason had been completely cut out, and she had made sure that there would be no way for him or anyone else to challenge her decisions. Claire had been meticulous in ensuring that the clauses Ruth requested were bulletproof, airtight. No loopholes, no gray areas. Any legal contest will void all claims to the estate. It was a simple but final statement, something that would protect her peace long after she was gone. She had no desire to revisit the pain of the past, no interest in watching Jason scramble for scraps of what he thought was his birthright. Ruth had given him years of opportunities to be a son to her, and now the door was closed. She wasn't angry anymore, just resolute. This was her decision, and it was final. The sound of the doorbell broke her concentration, and Ruth glanced at the clock. Emma, as always, was early today. She opened the door to find her granddaughter standing there, arms laden with grocery bags, a smile lighting up her face. "Hey, Grandma. Brought the fixings for that stew you love," Emma said with a grin, stepping inside. "Perfect timing," Ruth replied. "I was just finishing up something." They moved to the kitchen, unpacking the groceries and getting to work. Ruth felt her shoulders relax, the comfort of Emma's presence filling the room. It was moments like this, uncomplicated and filled with love, that reminded Ruth of what truly mattered. As Emma chopped vegetables, Ruth thought again about the clauses she'd included for Emma's protection. She'd ensured that Emma would have access to everything Ruth had left behind. But she'd also made it clear, no contact with manipulators. That included Jason, who, despite everything, would still try to worm his way into Emma's life. Not anymore. Emma was the only one who had shown Ruth the kind of respect she deserved, and Ruth had made sure that her future was secured, untainted by those who didn't value her. "Grandma," Emma said, her voice a little quieter than usual, "I updated my FAFSA. The funds are all set now, thanks to you." Ruth smiled softly. "I'm glad you're set. You've worked so hard for this. I just want to make sure you know it's not about the money for me," Emma continued, setting the knife down and looking at Ruth. "You've always been there for me, and I know this is just part of the way you've always been looking out for me." Ruth reached across the table, gently taking Emma's hand. "I know, sweetheart. You're the only one I trust with my door code." The words were simple, but Emma knew exactly what Ruth meant. She had seen Ruth at her most vulnerable, and Emma had been there to help her rebuild. Later that day, as the stew simmered on the stove, Ruth sat down at her desk, her phone buzzing in front of her. She glanced at the screen. Jason. She didn't pick up. She wasn't interested in hearing his voice, pleading or demanding. A few minutes later, a text arrived from Claire, confirming that the paperwork was filed and locked into place. Everything was official. Ruth felt a quiet relief. This was her peace, her protection. There was no going back. But then the phone buzzed again. A call from an unknown number. Ruth didn't hesitate. She blocked it. "Your silence is the best volume you've ever used," Wendy had said to her just the other day, a knowing smile on her face. Ruth smiled at the thought. It was true. She had learned to speak through her actions, through the boundaries she had set. She wasn't waiting anymore. The world could try to pull her back into its web, but Ruth was no longer tethered to it. She was free. As she looked out the window, the last of the evening sun casting soft shadows across the room, Ruth knew she had made the right choice. Her future was set. No more waiting, no more manipulation. And she was at peace. She had done the work, and now it was Emma's turn to carry the lessons forward. And Ruth knew, more than anything, that no one would take that from her. The envelope from Jason sat on Ruth's kitchen table, its presence a silent reminder of what had been, what should have been. The card was there, unopened, untouched. She had seen it coming, but now that it was here, there was no desire to tear it open and read the words she had already heard 1,000 times. Apologies, excuses, promises. Her hands rested on the edge of the table as she studied the card, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. It was too late for words. She had made her decision, and there was nothing left to discuss. With a slow, deliberate movement, Ruth slid the card back into its envelope and tossed it into the trash. It was final. The door was closed. There would be no more waiting for Jason to come around, no more hoping he would change. It was over. The next day, Ruth met with Claire again. The air in the room comfortable, familiar. Claire was always on top of the details, and Ruth trusted her completely to finalize the steps she'd set in motion. It was time to wrap everything up: digital estate, passwords, photos, messages. All of it needed to be locked down. Claire worked through the specifics with Ruth, ensuring everything was safe, secure, and under her control. The digital footprint of Ruth's life, her history, was protected now. No one would be able to access what was hers. "Everything's set," Claire confirmed after a few hours. "The will's filed, and your digital legacy is locked up tight." Emma will have access when she's ready, but only what you want her to. Ruth let out a long breath, the finality of it settling into her bones. She was ready now, ready to let go of the past and focus on what truly mattered. Emma, the one who had seen her, the one who hadn't turned away. Later that afternoon, Emma arrived at Ruth's house, her arms full of boxes. "I've been thinking," Emma said as she entered, her eyes scanning the room. "What if we digitize your old recipes and journals? We can preserve them, make sure they're never lost." Ruth smiled softly. "That sounds perfect." Together, they spent the afternoon going through the pages of Ruth's favorite cookbooks, scanning the yellowed, handwritten recipes that had been passed down through generations. Each dish had a story, memories of Ruth's childhood, of cooking with her mother, of moments in the kitchen that had shaped her life. Ruth shared the stories as Emma carefully digitized each page. There was something beautiful in the quiet companionship of the moment. No distractions, no expectations. Just Ruth and Emma, creating a legacy that was safe, clean, and protected. The recipes, the journals, her memories, all of it would be preserved for Emma, who would carry them forward, just as Ruth had carried them. As the evening grew darker, Ruth sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of everything that had been settled. There was peace in the knowledge that her legacy was now clean, no longer tangled with the strings of manipulation or unspoken promises. But as Ruth went to check her phone, she saw an unexpected call, Jason's name flashing across the screen. Ruth hesitated only for a moment before declining the call. She wasn't ready to hear from him. Not now, not ever again. A few days later, Emma received a text. It was from Jason, frantic, asking if they could meet. Emma read it aloud, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not meeting with him, Grandma." Ruth nodded, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. Emma had learned, had grown strong in ways Ruth had hoped for her. "You taught her boundaries without knowing it," Ruth murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Emma smiled, her eyes filled with an understanding that ran deep. She had seen her grandmother at her most vulnerable, and now she was walking beside her, helping Ruth build something that would last far beyond what Jason could ever take. And that was enough. Ruth stood at the podium, the dim lights above casting a soft glow over the audience. The room was filled with women, many of whom had lived through their own quiet struggles, each of them carrying stories of neglect and compromise. Ruth had once been one of them, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for the care that never came. Today, she would speak not for sympathy, but for strength. The microphone felt cool against her lips as she took a deep breath, centering herself. She looked out over the sea of faces, some weary, some hopeful, all of them searching for a way out of the silence. "I spent too many years being invisible," Ruth began, her voice steady, clear. "Waiting for someone, anyone, to notice that I existed beyond my role. I gave and gave, always hoping for recognition. But what I've learned is that waiting for that kind of recognition only wears you down." The room went still. Ruth paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. This wasn't just her story, it was theirs too. She saw it in their eyes, the quiet pain, the understanding. She wasn't alone anymore. "I realized," Ruth continued, her voice gaining strength, "that family is not a reward for blood. It's about presence. If they weren't there when it mattered, why should they get what I've worked for?" She let the question hang in the air, a sharp truth that cut through the room. Ruth could feel the energy shift. It wasn't about what she had lost. It was about what she had gained. The decision to reclaim her power had been hers, and she was no longer afraid of what others would think. "I stopped waiting for people to change. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come," she said, each word carving deeper into the silence. And that, for me, was the beginning of freedom. The room erupted into applause, slow at first, tentative, but building as the realization hit. Ruth's speech wasn't just a personal confession. It was a declaration, an invitation for others to reclaim their own boundaries. In the back row, Ruth caught Claire's eye. A small, knowing smile passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had both been on. This moment, this shared understanding, was everything Ruth had worked for. After the talk, Ruth met with a few of the women who had stayed behind. They were all in various stages of reclaiming their power, rewriting their wills, taking back control of their lives. There was a palpable sense of solidarity, a shared understanding that they had all been through something similar. They weren't alone anymore. "I've been working on my own will," one woman said, her voice tentative but full of resolve. "And it feels different this time. It feels like I'm doing it for myself." Ruth smiled, proud of the way these women were standing up for themselves, taking charge in a way that felt both freeing and terrifying. But they were doing it. And that, Ruth realized, was the point of it all. They were rewriting their own stories. Later that week, Ruth's story was featured on a popular podcast about elder justice. She shared her journey, her decisions, her triumphs, and the lessons she had learned along the way. Emma, always her biggest supporter, shared the episode with her friends on campus. The story was starting to ripple out, reaching others who needed to hear it, who needed to know they weren't alone. But not everyone was moved by Ruth's message. Leah, predictably, left an anonymous comment online. "Bitter elders ruin generational wealth." Ruth saw it, but it didn't sting anymore. She read it twice, then deleted it. Leah's words held no power over her now. They never had, and they never would. The day ended with Ruth sitting at the kitchen table with Wendy, a warm cup of tea in hand. The steam rose in gentle swirls, and Ruth looked out the window at the fading light. "I never thought I'd be here," Ruth said, her voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "But now, it's like the fog is gone." Wendy smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "You've always had the strength, Ruth. You just needed to see it for yourself." As the sun set, Ruth felt a sense of peace settle in her chest, deeper than it had ever been before. The door had closed on one chapter of her life, but the one ahead felt wide open, filled with possibility. For the first time in years, Ruth smiled fully, unafraid, unapologetic, and free. The spring afternoon was soft and quiet, like the world itself had slowed down just for Ruth. Her favorite armchair by the window creaked slightly as she settled into it, the warmth of the sun casting a golden glow across the room. The air smelled faintly of flowers from the garden outside, and everything felt calm, peaceful, like everything had fallen into place. Ruth's passing was serene, without drama or fanfare. She had lived a full life, surrounded by the things that mattered most: Emma, her memories, and the home she had built over the years. Ruth had always known she wanted to pass quietly, at peace, without the weight of unresolved issues hanging over her. A few days after her passing, Claire, Ruth's lawyer, took over the final details. Ruth's will was executed without complications, just as Ruth had planned. Every clause, every detail had been carefully crafted, and everything proceeded exactly as Ruth had instructed. Jason was completely cut out, with no room for negotiation. The trust was unassailable, and her legacy was sealed. When Jason received his letter, it was exactly what Ruth had intended: short, direct, and final. "You made time for drinks. I made time for decisions." The words were a quiet, cutting reminder of his absence in her life, the years he had taken for granted. The inheritance wasn't a reward for blood. It was a consequence of presence, of showing up when it mattered. Jason stared at the letter in his hands. The truth was undeniable. The decision had been made, and there was no way to change it. Ruth had given him all the chances he deserved, but now there was nothing left for him to claim. No explanation, no attempt at reconciliation. His past actions had sealed his fate. Leah received nothing, not a letter, not a note, not a single acknowledgement. Ruth had removed her entirely from her life. Leah's place in Ruth's world was as absent as her presence had been over the years. Ruth had decided that what she had to give wouldn't go to someone who had only ever taken, someone who had never truly seen her. But for Emma, everything had changed. The house, the savings, the letters, everything Ruth had built over the years was now Emma's. There was one rule Ruth had set clearly: no contact with manipulators. That rule wasn't just about Jason and Leah. It was about anyone who didn't understand the boundaries Ruth had spent years putting into place. Emma was the only one Ruth trusted with that legacy, and Emma understood it. She understood that the real inheritance wasn't about money. It was about respect, boundaries, and strength. Later, Ruth's name was etched into a local scholarship, an act of quiet defiance against a world that often overlooked women like her. The scholarship was set up in Ruth's honor to support young women who demonstrated the same resilience and determination Ruth had always embodied. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was her way of ensuring that her legacy lived on, not through possessions, but through the people she helped. Emma stood at the ceremony, her heart full as she thought about what this scholarship would mean. It wasn't just about the money or the recognition, it was about continuing the work Ruth had started, ensuring that the future was shaped by the lessons Ruth had taught her. She had learned so much from her grandmother, not just about money, but about what it means to stand firm in your choices, to protect what's yours, and to never apologize for demanding respect. The day of the ceremony ended quietly. Emma walked home, the sun beginning to set behind her, casting long shadows over the path. Ruth's house stood in the distance, its windows glowing warmly in the fading light. It was hers now, not just a house, but a home filled with love, memories, and a legacy that could never be touched. As Emma entered the house, she knew that nothing would ever take this from her. Ruth's legacy was now hers to carry, and she would protect it as fiercely as her grandmother had protected her. And with that knowledge came peace, peace that the past had been left behind, and the future was in good hands. The envelope from Ruth sat on Emma's kitchen counter, the weight of it unmistakable. She had left it there for days, unsure if she was ready to read what Ruth had written. But tonight, with the quiet hum of her new life surrounding her, Emma finally reached for it. She had already unpacked most of her things, but the letter, Ruth's final words to her, had stayed untouched, waiting. She opened the envelope carefully, pulling out the folded piece of paper. Ruth's handwriting, graceful and deliberate, filled the page. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of love and wisdom. "Emma," it began, "I have always known you would carry this forward. You've been my strength and my heart. I'm proud of you, not for what you've done, but for who you are. You've never needed permission to be yourself, and I hope you never forget that." Emma sat down at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands. Tears welled up in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer force of Ruth's belief in her. This letter, this simple gesture, was more than anything Emma could have hoped for. It was everything Ruth had been to her, steadfast, unwavering, and fiercely protective. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, setting the letter aside. The tears flowed freely now, not out of loss, but from a deep well of gratitude. Ruth had never doubted her, had always seen the potential in Emma that she had sometimes struggled to see in herself. This letter was Ruth's final gift, a piece of herself she would carry forever. The next morning, as Emma sorted through boxes, she found the recipe box Ruth had given her. She opened the lid, and the scent of old paper and spices filled the air. The recipe cards, carefully handwritten by Ruth over the years, sat neatly in the box. Each card was a memory, a lesson Ruth had passed down through generations. Emma picked one at random, Ruth's cornbread recipe, and smiled softly. It was the recipe they had made together countless times. She had tried to master it, but it always seemed to come out slightly different when Ruth was around. She closed the box, feeling the warmth of those moments flood back. The box wasn't just a collection of recipes. It was a symbol of everything Ruth had given her, of the love that had been poured into every meal, every memory. It was worth more than anything Jason or Leah could ever claim. But Jason, of course, tried. The week after Ruth's passing, he filed a lawsuit, hoping to contest the will, to grab a piece of what he thought was his birthright. He couldn't accept that Ruth had made the decision to shut him out, but the courts had no sympathy. The case was dismissed quickly, Ruth's wishes were clear, and there was no room for his entitlement. Leah, too, was left with nothing. Her schemes had come to an end. She was forced to file for bankruptcy, her dreams of the lake house slipping through her fingers. Ruth had seen it all coming, and now Emma was free from the weight of their demands. With everything settling, Emma focused on building her life. She was on her own now, with Ruth's legacy to guide her. She bought new supplies for her apartment, the bare essentials at first, but with each new purchase, the space felt more like her own. A home built not on material things, but on the lessons Ruth had passed down. Emma stood in the kitchen, looking at the recipe box, then at the empty space around her. Ruth's final lesson was clear. She had left Emma everything she needed, not in wealth, but in wisdom, in strength, and in the ability to stand firm. She smiled to herself, the weight of the past lifting. Ruth's legacy, the real inheritance, wasn't something that could be taken. It was something that would last forever, and Emma was ready to carry it forward. Emma stood in the middle of Ruth's living room, the sun streaming in through the windows, casting long shadows over the room. The house felt quieter now, more hers. The shelves were filled with books, the walls covered in photos of moments long past. But it was peaceful here. The place that had once been Ruth's sanctuary was now Emma's, and she had filled it with the same warmth that Ruth had cultivated over the years. It was exactly as Ruth had left it, quiet, yet alive with memories. The recipe box sat on the kitchen counter, a small symbol of everything Ruth had left behind: her love, her wisdom, and her legacy. Emma had made the house her own, but she never forgot the lessons Ruth had taught her. She had filled the rooms with life, not with things, but with meaning. The things that Ruth had once treasured were now Emma's to cherish. Emma looked over at the kitchen wall. It was simple, unadorned, except for one line, a line that Ruth had written in her will. "Care isn't what you say, it's what you show up for." The words seemed to echo in Emma's heart, reminding her of everything Ruth had lived by and everything she now carried forward. Jason, once so close, was now a distant memory. He had moved away without fanfare, a quiet departure that no one noticed. The world hadn't stopped for him, and it certainly hadn't slowed down in response to his absence. He had made his choices, and Ruth had sealed his fate long ago. Claire, too, carried Ruth's legacy forward in a different way. Ruth's story had become part of her lectures, her lessons on elder justice, on standing up for yourself, and on the importance of boundaries. When she spoke of Ruth, students leaned in, captivated by the story of a woman who had learned, too late, that the greatest inheritance is the freedom to choose your own path. Each year, on Ruth's birthday, Wendy lit a candle in her honor. It was a quiet ritual, a small act of remembrance. The flickering flame symbolized the quiet strength Ruth had always carried, a strength that lived on in the people she had touched. Emma, too, had a new tradition. As she settled into her life, she shared Ruth's story with others, those who needed it most. She spoke of the boundaries Ruth had set, of the courage to stand firm, and the peace that came from choosing yourself. Emma had inherited more than a house or a bank account. She had inherited the kind of strength that couldn't be taken, a legacy that no one could ever touch. And as Emma sat down at the kitchen table one evening, looking out the window at the fading sunset, she thought of Ruth, of the woman who had taught her the most important lessons of all. The final line, Ruth's last gift, was more than a statement. It was a declaration of independence, of strength, of freedom. It was Ruth's final act, and it had forever changed Emma's life. My son made me take the bus home after my doctor's appointment because he was too busy getting drinks with his coworkers. So I took a cab to my lawyer's office and left him waiting for an inheritance that's never coming. And in that moment, as Emma reflected on Ruth's words, she understood. The true inheritance wasn't the house, or the savings, or even the recipes. It was the courage to take control of your own life, to protect your peace, and to choose the future you wanted. Ruth's legacy was now Emma's to carry, and with it came a quiet certainty. No one would take it from her.